I'm sure everybody here pretty much knows Steve. For a long time, he's obviously lives in Philadelphia and was a professor at Temple University and has lived there a long time. He's our Portugal expert, that's for sure. He knows everything about Portugal, and he's our past president from the Pennsylvania Postal History Society. So, without further ado, thanks, Steve. We really appreciate you being here tonight to kick us off and learn a little about Portugal.
Okay, thank you for the intro, Steve. This is another in the series of Pennsylvania Postal History presentations, which are available on our website. So you can always see it later if you missed it today. So I'd like to move right along because would like to leave a few minutes at least for questions at the end. But first, you can see I say southeastern Pennsylvania. I've expanded Philadelphia a bit, and because I have covers as far away as Easton, Morrisville, and actually one from Pottstown, rather, and Lansdowne as well. Now, as I say, Portugal is not a common destination for U.S. mail. I collect all mail from Portugal to the U.S., and this is just a slight section of it. Now, I've also included Portugal to include what is part of Portugal, because there's mail from Madeira and from the Azores, which, despite Scott calling them colonies, are actually integral parts of Portugal, and they have been ever since they were settled in the 15th century. They're not colonies at all any more than Wales and Northern Ireland are colonies of Great Britain. I also want to acknowledge a big gift from Dick Winter, who's my guru for rates and postal history. Dick recently published a two-part article on Portugal to U.S. mail in the Chronicle, and he discusses about 27 covers in that, and over half of them are ones which were mine at one time, or some of them still are, but none of those involve Philadelphia. So this is another tranche, and I break it down into 4 sections. Before 1862 is mail carried only by private ship. From 1862, we have postal treaties with the United Kingdom. That's the US treaty with Britain and Portugal's treaty with Britain. And in fact, 99% of the mail was carried via the UK. And the few exceptions, I do show one exception, which is sort of an interesting one. By 1875, we have the UPU and standardization of rates, and that goes up to about 1910, when Portugal stopped being a kingdom. There was a revolution, they declared a republic, and it's been a republic ever since. A little note about the currency: it's very easy to convert, because up until World War I inflation, 10 Portuguese reis, gold reis or kings, the plural of rei is reis, or after 1912, 1 centavo was equal to about 1 cent US. And so that makes, for example, on this cover at the top, there's a 40 here, which is a rate mark that was applied in Lisbon. That corresponds to 4 cents US, and that is what I call the arrival charge, or the charge from the pier to the destination. After 1912, there was inflation, but we needn't really worry about that. Portugal has uh, kept on the gold standard, and their currency was stable up until 1970 um, on the gold standard. Okay, well, let's move right along to my earliest cover. It's not the earliest. Um, it's not the earliest covers that exist, but these are from before the Revolution, 1763. And these are covers from Philadelphia addressed to Newton and Gordon and Murdoch, who were merchants in Madeira. Covers to Madeira are not rare because the Newton Gordon archive had over 50,000 covers, and all of them deal with the wine trade, or almost all of them deal with the wine trade. And they start about 1750. Nevertheless, there are not that many from Philadelphia. These were carried on private ships. They don't have postal markings. Almost certainly they didn't originate in Philadelphia. Well, they originated in Philadelphia. They almost certainly went to New York, privately carried to New York, and on a ship from New York sailing to Madeira. What it was is that we were buying Madeira wine and they were selling them grain. For the most part, Philadelphia was sending grain to Portugal. The next cover is one coming to Philadelphia, and this is one of the ones from the Historical Society of Philadelphia, which had a big sale of their archives without the contents. They saved the contents. But this again from Madeira in 1771, going to Philadelphia. And Mark Schwartz can tell you all the details of the rates. It arrived in New York, entered mails. It was marked ship, SH2 and 16, 2 pennyweights, 16 grains. And that translated it when it came to Philadelphia to 1 shilling 4 pence in the local currency. Now, the earliest one is about 1722. I don't have that. It was part of John Barwis's collection of Philadelphia to Great Britain mail. It's currently for sale on Hip Stamp for $1,500. A little out of my price range for a stampless cover. So, but that is the earliest one that I know of. So, okay, then let's go to the next one. Okay, now mail from Philadelphia from Portugal did come into Philadelphia, oftentimes going to other cities because ships at that time, they landed at the first port that they came to and they had to turn in the mail. The first cover is one which has a bishop mark, 1794, a Philadelphia bishop mark, or Franklin mark as it's called, going to Newburyport, and that paid the domestic postage. Now in the Confederation period, it was 22 cents, and there was a 4-cent ship fee, so that made 26. The bottom one shows 1801 shows the first Philadelphia date stamp, this sort of a cartwheel-like thing, going to Plymouth, and the rate then had gone down a little. It was 20 cents. The ship fee had gone down to 2 cents, so it was marked 22. Okay, as I said, a lot of the mail to Madeira went to New York, privately carried to New York. Here's one from 1800, again going to Newton, Gordon, and Murdoch. It was forwarded by Robert Lennox. This is a big thing on the back. says forwarded by your obedient servant, Robert Lennox. Lennox was the agent for Newton, Gordon, and Murdoch, arranging the sale of their wine. And it's the same Lennox for whom Lenox Avenue in New York and Lenox Hill is named for. And an awful lot of the mail going to Madeira, essentially from planters in the South and such, was sent to New York and then went by private ship to Madeira. That's the same one here. Now here we have mail going each way. Here's one letter from Lisbon coming in to Philadelphia, and direct paying the ship rate. That the 6 in a circle is the ship letter rate to the port of entry. So this one didn't go anywhere. Now here's a letter going to Oporto in Portugal. Porto is the second city of Portugal. It's about 200 miles north of Lisbon, and that's where the port wine comes from. And this is addressed to Coburn, Munchope, and Craig. Coburn is still in business of selling Coburn Port. And this was, again, a private ship letter by the brig Vancouver. Has no postal markings, so it probably was landed without going through the postal service, which was illegal, but it happened all the time. Now we have a couple of letters to Philadelphia, which came in other places. The top letter was endorsed to go via Baltimore, but instead it came to New York. It was marked ship and charged 14.5, which was a 12.5-cent rate to Philadelphia plus 2 cents captain's fee. The bottom one is a double rate, so the fee was 2 times 12.5 or 25 plus 2. The ship fee was independent of the weight. Now going the other way, here we have a first letter which has a rate stamp on it, and this is one of my favorites. This has been a part of had a stampless Portugal collection. This is quite a scarce cover. It's probably the finest known strike of this CDS shield of the Casa de Saúde do Porto de Belém. Belém is about 3 miles west of the center of Lisbon. That's where the Tower of Belém, which is on the symbol of Portugal, appears on many of their tourist things. Is the Tower of Belém is there. And if at various periods when there was a necessary to disinfect them, this is what they did. So this is a disinfection mark. This mark went through the post office because it received a CSN, Carta Estrangeiro de Navio, fancy way of saying foreign ship letter. And the oval, and this paid 240, which corresponds to the second weight step. The first weight step was 160. And the second, that was up to a half ounce. From a half to 3/4 was 240, and 80 cents for every quarter ounce, 80 reis, and so forth. This is interesting in that, notice it's addressed to Lisbon and it's addressed to Sampaio, which, although it was a Portuguese name. At that time, the royal family had fled to Brazil as the Napoleonic Wars were over, and Portugal was really administered by the Brits. The British Army ran Portugal, and Sampaio was the quartermaster general. So this letter probably had to deal with him buying supplies for the British Army, maybe grain uh, from uh, from Philadelphia. Okay, now we have a couple of letters going to Madeira with rate marks. So the earlier ones didn't have rate marks, but it seems that about 1820 or so, they started charging. And here's one again, Newton Gordon Murdoch. And this has been forwarded in New York by North and Pedersen via the brig, whatever the name of the brig is there, or it's a bark, I'm not sure. The 40 seems to be the smallest one. Now, in 1839, by about the mid 1830s, the incoming ship letter rate had been stabilized at 160 for half ounce. It's interesting that, of course, is 16 cents US, but it's 8 pence in the British system. And the British charged 8 pence for all ship letters coming in. And you have to realize that most of the mail between Portugal and Britain was controlled by Britain. It was on their ships. So here's another forwarding one via the ship Mexican. Again, they're ordering wine from Madeira. Okay. Now, there's an unusual one. It's going from Philadelphia to Oporto, but the ship was not going directly to Oporto. The ship went to Madeira, and it was forwarded in Madeira by James Adams. That's not a very Portuguese name, of course, but most of the merchants in Madeira were Brits, or there were some Americans there. So this was then forwarded on to mainland Portugal from Madeira, and it had to pay 40 cents was the standard rate for a letter from Madeira to the mainland, and then another 40 to go from Lisbon to Porto. It has a Lisbon transit mark on the back. Here's just another example of a 160 race rate, now with a hand stamp in Madeira. They're the 1840s. They're getting, they have hand stamps rather than just pen marks. And this is forwarded again by La Sala and company. And this is a letter which it may deal with the wine trade, but essentially it's a bank statement from this guy, Jacob Snyder, who was the banker for the addressee, eventual addressee, Mr. Noronha. Okay, finally, and this is the last letter in the stampless period. It's from Morrisville, and it's addressed to Surgeon George Clymer, USS Jamestown, Island of St. Vincent, Cape de Verde, via Southampton, England. Now, at this period, you could send a letter by British mails, but it was very expensive to send one. The rate to Madeira or to the Azores or to Cape Verde. Cape Verde is off the coast of Africa. It's on the line between Europe and Brazil, and the island of St. Vincent had this natural harbor, Porto Grande, which was used by ships of all nations as a coaling station and a victualling station. Britain made out like bandits on this mail. 65 cents was paid. Now that consisted of the 24-cent rate from the US to Britain, And again, there was a 20, 1 shilling 9 pence, which is 22 pence or 44 cents. I have 22 cents here. It should be 44 US cents. Going to Cape Verde. And because it went on British shipping all the way, the US paid 60, but Britain collected 60 of it, marked by this here. So it went via the Cunarder to Liverpool, and then it went to London, and it went on the Royal Mail steam packet ship, which left the Royal Mail steam packet had monthly service to Brazil, always leaving on, or trying to leave on March 9th. And it definitely, that was the ship it was on, because it arrived in Saint Vincent. And then it was docketed by Surgeon Clymer on the 25th. This is a quite large correspondence. It was his wife writing to him, and his letters are huge. Many of them are at the 130 double rate. So she loved him, and wrote. Of course, there was no Facebook in those days, so she had to. This is sort of the only one I have of this correspondence, but there is it's a large correspondence. I might point out that almost all the letters that survive are part of correspondences. They're very little one-offs, so to speak. Well, now we get to the second part of our talk, and this is mail which goes through the British Treaty. Again, the previous cover was on the British Treaty, but the one on the title page, which is from the early 1860s, paying the 33-cent rate, is when we started putting stamps on letters. And stamps on letters to any place other than Britain from the US are uncommon, and they're highly collected. Portugal is not one of the commonest destinations. The rate was 33 cents, and the rate in the other direction was 320 reis. We didn't have to use stamps, and mostly people didn't. So here's one that went, again, by British mails. It was turned in to the British Packet Office in Lisbon, which had been operating since the early 1700s. And it had this oval, pago de franquia pelo paquete, paid the packet postage. And inside was manuscripted the amount, which was 1 shilling 4 pence, which was equivalent to 33 cents US or 320 reis. It then went, well, probably to London first, then to Liverpool, and then on the, I'm sorry, I keep going backwards, then on the Cunarder. There's very little mail which has stamps on it before the late 1860s. The bottom cover, you might say, well, why would I put this piece of crap in there? Because now originally it had 320 reis of stamps on it. It had 3 hundreds, where there was the mauve stamp, and 2 tens, which were yellow. They've been torn off. This went on a US packet, so the credit to the US in this case was 16 cents for the transatlantic mail. I show this because it's the only cover that I have at this rate, and it's the only one that I've ever seen. As far as covers with the 100 Reich stamp on them, there are domestic covers with the quadruple domestic rate, and there are covers with 300 Reich stamps, but this is the only one I've ever seen at the US 320 Reich rate. Now the next one is also a cover with stamps, and this is at the 228-cent rate, 280 Reich rate, which is not listed in Starnes. And this was only good for prepaid letters. You couldn't pay a unpaid letter at this rate. And this is part of a correspondence of which there are probably about 10 covers known, going to Easton, to the Glendon Iron Works. Easton, of course, is Northampton County. This is franked with Portuguese stamps. Here they're in good condition. 200s, a 50, a green 50, and a 10. And this went on the Inman, the US packet, but again, via England. And the 16 was the credit to the US there. And the recipient had to pay down here due 5 cents, because that's when it got into New York, American packet was marked 5, which was what it was. This also happens to be the earliest known cover with this particular stamp, the 20 Reich, so-called curved label, because the top where it says 20 is in a curved ribbon. Before then, the stamps just showed the head of the king. They didn't say it was Portugal, because they were not designed for international use. They were only really for domestic use. These are the first stamps that had Portugal in the left margin of the king's head. Okay, now here's another cover again at the 32-cent rate, 33-cent rate, which I don't understand. I don't think anyone else does either. It's been written up in the Chronicle. It's a mistake. Like the cover on the title page, it was going to a sailor. It should have been paid to destination and should have paid 40 cents for the 40 Reich arrival charge. Instead, someone in Portugal marked it, or maybe in England, it was marked paid only to England, and thus it was charged 160, which would have been the ship letter rate for something coming to Portugal. Shouldn't have been that. It was sent to it was in care of the U.S. consul, who was supposed to forward it to wherever the Canandaigua was. Instead, they sent it back to Southampton. And when it got back there, somebody had to pay, the US consul, presumably, had to pay 1 shilling and twopence on it. It's one of these letters which has been written up several times. I'm fortunate to have it. It went through several hands. Well, here's one that only went through a couple of hands to get to me. And it's there was an earlier one, and this one is addressed to Mrs. Cromwell in Germantown, care of James Huber. Huber was a lawyer, and the Cromwell correspondence is quite a large one. I have several Cromwell covers in this period, and the same correspondence went on up to the early years of the 20th century. This is again, now it's a 280 Reich rate, but it's the double rate. The single rate had dropped to a 160 in 1870. So this has 200s and an 80. Very nice clean cover. Went via London. went on an Inman ship, and it's backstamped in Philadelphia on the 19th. Now, this Philadelphia backstamp, this sort of, I call it a rink, a violet rink. I know of about 10 examples of this. And there's a question of why was this on there? And one reason that I advance is that most of the mail went via New York. This does not have a New York transit on it. The ones that I've seen, it only appears when there was, or seldom appears when there was no New York transit. It was probably bagged directly to Philadelphia. Okay, so moving right along. Here now is the 160 rate single rate for a quarter ounce in the 1870s. And this is a typical rate going, it says via France and Spain. It usually went via land on a rail to Spain and then to France, and then across the channels from Calais to get on a Cunarder. And at that point, Britain claimed 6.5 pence, which is equivalent to 130 race. So Portugal only got 30 race, or 3 cents for this, which is about what the domestic postage would be. Here's another example. Well, this one is also going Mrs. Cromwell. Here's one going to the merchant Stefan and Company. And there are quite a few covers going to Stefan and Company. Mrs. Cromwell got mail. They didn't always use 2 80s. They used, again, a 120, which was blue, and 2 20s there. And again, via Cunarder, the US got a credit of 2 cents for that. Now we come to the first cover that I owned in this of a Philadelphia mail was one I bought, and what got me started on this is I bought a collection in 1980, which was in 2 Scott albums of Portugal and colonies. It included this, and it included a one with, this has 9 hundreds, a 50 and a 10, making 960, which is the hextuple rate to Philadelphia. There was also one with 800s, the 5 times rate. I sold that cover for more than I had paid for the whole collection. So that was one of the best buys I ever made. And it got me into collecting this. This is the second highest franking known of any cover in this so-called straight label period with these stamps. And again, now this went on a US packet. So Britain only got 5.5 cents per quarter ounce, or 2 shillings and 9 pence. And the US got 6 cents out of the deal. Here's one of the double rate, again, the 280 race rate. This is going to a street address, which is unusual. This is probably official mail or legal mail. It's going to an insurance company, probably some sort of settlement. And the bottom one is now a letter from Madeira. Madeira used the same stamps as Portugal, but they were overprinted Madeira, straight line. And this is going strangely to Wallace Street in West Philadelphia. which was then pretty fashionable. There was a suburb then, and the rate was a little different. This didn't go via Lisbon; it went directly from Madeira to Liverpool, probably on one of the South African packets, and Britain collected 7 pence on this one. Here's another one of the, again, in the same correspondence, going to 431 Chestnut Street, the insurance company. Now, in late 1875, Portugal joined the GPU, later became the UPU, and the rate was reduced from 160 to 50 reis, or 20 centimes in the gold centimes in the French system. And now there were no longer any accountancy marks. Each country retained all postage. So we don't generally have back stamps on it as for transit. And here's a simple example, again, going to Chestnut Street, of the 50 reis rate. The 50 reis stamp was green. We'll see in a little while later what happened. Now, just if you heard Rob Fawkes talk a couple of weeks ago, the government loved to get short paid letters because they gave no credit at all for what was paid. And here's one that a guy, it wasn't a merchant, probably it was a civilian, writing to Philadelphia, tried to pay the domestic rate from Alcobaça to Lisbon. Naturally, in Lisbon, they marked it insufficiently paid, franquia insufficient, and sent it on. Well, there's a lot of calculation on here because there are not that many examples of these insufficient franking. It's hard to figure exactly what was done, but my feeling is that they gave him 1 cent. The recipient had to pay 23 cents. And they gave him 1 cent credit for the partial payment. Again, there are other alternatives to how it happened. Here's an example of a double rate letter. And this is endorsed via France. Now, again, it didn't have, because it doesn't have any back stamps, we don't know exactly how it went. Typically, the mail at that period went on land via Spain and France over to England. This is unusual in having this green dotted rim date stamp, which I have only seen on mail that seems to start at the port in Alcântara in Lisbon. And it went via France. I suspect this may have gone on a French ship, and it didn't go, it probably went on a French ship to Bordeaux, and then on rail to Paris, and then possibly, almost certainly on a Cunarder. It may have gone across from Cherbourg to Cork or Queenstown in Ireland to get on the Cunarder. So noted, it says it's only addressed to Hector or printer. So he must have been very well known at the time. The UPU simplified mail handling, as we see. Here's a typical one from Philadelphia. I have this because of Gus, who sold me a bunch of these. And this one has a 5 cent tailor, went via London. There's a Philadelphia postmark and the blob. The only arrival mark is this franca here, which means paid. Okay, let's go on. It doesn't seem to want to go on. Okay. The bottom one we'll talk first. In 1879, the Portugal got together with the UPU, and they wanted the letter rate, the foreign letter rate stamp, to be blue. So the 50 rate stamp was reprinted from green to blue. The top one, the 50 rate, was paid with 2 of the red domestic rate stamps. And this normally went via London. But it has an interesting arrival mark, Navy Yard, Philadelphia. I'd never seen this before. I asked around, no one else had seen it. I mentioned it in the Historian 10, 12 years ago, and no one else has come up with anything. So I still would be interested in knowing the origin of that Navy Yard mark. Okay, here the Azores had much less mail, and even less mail from Philadelphia. Here's one again at the letter rate from Horta, which is on the island of Fayal. And then here in 82 it looks like the same stamp, but it's a 10 race stamp, and presumably this is printed matter rate. That was the correct printed matter rate. It's not a morning cover. It was mounted on a blue background. I don't know if G.S. Hoppy was the piano maker. Okay, a couple of, I'll skip that, a couple of postcards, which are not too exciting. Here's a US postcard at the 2-cent rate, and one coming back at the 20 race rate in Philadelphia. By the turn of the century, we have starting getting philatelic mail. So here are 2 covers from the Azores, possibly addressed to collectors. It was back that starting, people would get the stamps, they would send to a correspondent, and would put a bunch of stamps on it. These are both at the 50 race rate, but made up with low value stamps, probably for collectors. Now the top one, as you can see, took over a month to get there because it had to go via Lisbon. The bottom one got to Philadelphia in 8 days. And almost certainly, I say, this was carried by the North German Lloyd, which had North German Lloyd ships made a stop in the Azores, and they didn't stop in Horta, they stopped in Velish on the island of St. George, but that was a very short distance from Horta. So this is a North German Lloyd mail, although it doesn't have any markings as such. Okay, moving very quickly now. In the late, around the turn of the century, there was a currency devaluation, and the rates went up about 15 or 20%. So here's a registered cover from Lisbon to Philadelphia to the Allen Company. Then the rate had gone up from 100 to 115. They paid 120 for convenience franking. It's from an agricultural equipment manufacturer, and it's addressed to the Allen Company. And the Allen Company's, their main product were seed drills and such, but they also made something that I wanted as a youth and everyone wanted, was a flexible flyer sled. That was the Allen Company's major product. They're no longer with us. Here's again a 5 times rate registered cover going to the Philadelphia Commercial Museum, which, as I understand it, was essentially a place you advertised your products by sending them a sample. Now, finally, we have the turn of the century, another naval cover. This is going to Edward Leeper, the lieutenant on the USS Essex. It's addressed care of B.F. Stevens, Trafalgar Square, London. And B.F. Stevens was the agent for the fleet. They received mail and marked it with a violet oval here, B.F. Stevens, and forwarded. In this case, it went in care of the U.S. consul in Funchal, Madeira. I have one going to Lisbon as well, although not from Philadelphia. And people who collect B.F. Stevens mail, there are probably 100 or more ports where there are B.F. Stevens markings. Well, that's a nice thing to add. Here's again a typical registered cover in this period. It does have a Station S back stamp. I collect stations, and the back stamps of the stations, registry back stamps, aren't that common. A couple of tourist postcards from the Azores, probably sold with the stamp already affixed. The bottom one already has a stamp on the front. They probably said, "Oh, you need another one to mail it." So, okay, and then we have a postcard. Again, this is a domestic rate postal card. In 1910, they got rid of the king, and the stamps had a picture of the goddess Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. Those were used for about 20 years. This one essentially says, "I'm doing fine. I'm in Funchal, and send you 2 postcards for your collection." This is again going to Schoolhouse Lane in Germantown, which is less than a mile from where I live. The bottom cover is a printed matter cover. Again, the rate was at that point was 1.5 cents, but they, due to convenience franking of 2, it was censored by the French. This is a French censor marking. It's addressed to the N&G Taylor Company. Taylor was the country's leading manufacturer of tin roofs, steel roofing. Their factory was in Nicetown, again, not too far from where I am. They're, of course, no longer in business. And I don't think the Allen flexible flyer people are still in Philadelphia either. Here's just a typical US 5-cent cover going to Portugal. This is, I love the address, the Viscountess of Villa Verde, Largo de Milagro. That's in Santarém, Portugal. What a lady. Here's again a cover from the Taylor Company, steel roof company. The rate has gone up a little bit from 5 to 7.5. Censored, Portuguese censor in Lisbon. The bottom one is a double rate going to the flexible flyer people. Again, censored, but the double rate, which had been 10, it had gone up to 12. Here's finally one going on pouch mail. Pouch mail had to pay Portuguese postage from the US legation. This blue cancel is the legation cancel. The cover went to, although it was addressed to Philadelphia, it went in the diplomatic pouch to Washington, and then it was forwarded to Philadelphia. There's quite a few of these diplomatic pouch mail. John Hotchner collects them, so he's always in lookout for them. Finally, a couple of covers. This is what looks like a simple airmail cover, which is should have been a dollar box, or maybe now they aren't dollar boxes, they're $5 boxes. But I didn't pay, I don't think I paid more than $1 or $2 for this one. It's going to International Resistance Company, pays a $3.75 rate. Lots of mail on the clippers. The only trouble is the clippers started in May of 39. This is in 37. So why was it going airmail? The foreign rate by that time was $1.75. Mr. Faria paid $3.75. Turns out there was an air assisted rate. This paid the airmail. There was no transatlantic airmail, but there was airmail from Lisbon to Paris, which was, at that time, it was daily when it flew. It didn't fly every day, but it tried to. And for 2 escudos extra, you could get your letter to Paris in maybe in 5 or 6 hours, rather than the 1 day that it took on the train. And from Paris, it went on a steamer across the Atlantic. So if you see these $3.75 cover before 1939, buy it for me and I'll reimburse you. They're quite scarce. Here's what it should have been. Here's a cover going, the rate by the clipper was $5.25 for a single cover. And the airmail was at a 5-gram increment. So a cover that weighed, say, 12 grams paid triple air rate, which would be $10.50, 2 escudos registry, and $1.75 postage. And of course, this had US censorship. And I think the last cover is one which has an unusual mark, Au soin de l'expéditeur, in care of the sender. This is what was probably a consignee's letter. You had to pay the postage if something was going outside of the mails. So you took it to the post office. They put a stamp on it, canceled it, and marked it in care of the sender. So this was going on the ship, the Luango. It was a consignee letter. Probably the ship was carrying a cargo of paprika, and it was headed to New York, except the ship came into Philadelphia. I guess for some reason they delivered the letter. It was back-stamped Philadelphia. It was delivered to the British consulate, who put a US stamp on it and sent it to New York. As far as I know, there are only I know of about a dozen covers with this in care of the sender marking. Quite uncommon, and I'm always on the outlook for more. I published a couple of articles on them already. So that's about it, and I thank you for your attention. And I think I've left 5 minutes for questions, if there are any. I hear silence. Put everyone to sleep.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Any questions, anyone?
No.
I think you were pretty thorough there, Steve. We really appreciate it. This is, I know for me, it's some really interesting stuff that I haven't seen before. Maybe some other guys have, but I'm still the new guy. But this looks really awesome to me, especially the Philadelphia part. But, thank you very much for showing and sharing this with us.
What I'm trying to get more interested in now is the social aspects of it, and what business these companies were in. For the most part, they're companies where Philadelphia 100 years ago led the world, and now they don't even exist. Such as I'm sure the S.L. Allen Company doesn't make flexible flyers in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
There's another one, Blaybon and Company made linoleum. They were the country's major linoleum manufacturers. Of course, we know of Diston saws and Stetson hats and Philco refrigerators. And,
Well, the good part is now there's so much online material where you can research things. That's got to be very helpful too. So I try to include some of those in my weekly newsletter. If anybody has any others they'd like me to share, please send them to me and I'll include them in the newsletter. And hopefully that'll be useful for people.
Hey, Steve, I'll give you a softball if you'll let me share a screen.
okay.
I admit to not knowing much about postal history, so this is all very enjoyable and all pretty new to me. But I have your 1771 early letter had a marking on the front that I think you referred to it as a ship manuscript marking, and I had one cover that this guy Schultz talked me into acquiring because it had a Brandywine ship marking on it. There's a Flourish manuscript cancel on the front that I'm not sure I can read it, and I'm sure probably anybody on this call could tell me what it is if I could show it.
So I say stop share. Yeah. Okay, I stopped share, so you can share.
Yeah, I have to see if I can find it. I thought I had it up earlier. I did have it up earlier. No, that's not it. I hate when this happens, and I apologize.
But do you see the share button there at the bottom, the green up arrow?
Yeah, but I have to find the right screen to share, and it's not showing it to me for some reason. I'll have to see if I can find it anyway.
Okay, well, Bob, if you'll send it to me in email, I'll send it out to everyone. And
Okay.
because I'm going to send out the link to this if anybody missed the beginning or anything like that. That way I'll have the whole thing. I edited it down to just the presentation. So I'll include that, Bob, with my email.
Here it is.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I don't know why I couldn't see it before, but this marking right here, I think says ship, but I don't know. And Bill, you'll recognize that as the item that you talked me into.
What's the
It's 1829. And
well, it's got the ship stamp on there. Would it say it twice also, with a manuscript? Is that
here's the printed, yeah.
right?
Anyway, I'll send it to you. If anybody else has any ideas.
Bob, could you put your cursor on what you're? Oh, there. That I think that's the word honorable. It's a short for honorable.
And this flourish goes all the way over here.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, but that's
But
a
this
guess.
is to a
That's
Mrs. Ann
Yeah.
Rustenberger.
Yeah.
Mrs.
Doesn't seem to play through, but I don't. That would be my guess.
Yeah, but if you could just send me an image of that, Bob, I'd appreciate it, and I'll send it out because it looks very interesting. I'm sure people would be interested to know. That'd be cool. Okay. If nobody has anything else, we're going to jump over to another meeting. We're getting the Mid-Atlantic Federation of Postal History Societies started. So if anybody wants any information about that, also please shoot me an email. I'd be happy to include you. We're always looking for people to participate. Really appreciate you being here. And like I said, I'm sending this out for this weekend. Thanks very much.
Good, everybody.
Have a great evening.
Hey.
All right, good night.